from the beginning. I was born 1928, the year of the Depression, and my mother. I could tell you a little bit about my parents. My mother was born in a little town called Aqua, Tennessee, and which contained all of 100 people. And that was a place that there was a Aqua Springs Hotel, very well known all over in Tennessee. In the 20s, people used to go to these hotels where there was mineral springs, and they would stay there and drink the water thinking they were going to get very, very well of any disease or anything. And so that's why there was this little community about Aqua. And my mother grew up there, and my father grew up in a little town called Farmington, which is near Lewisburg, Tennessee. And he was had two siblings, Uncle Carol and Aunt Evelyn, and his mother was. I never knew my grandfather. His mother was Miss Annie. She was Miss Annie Adams, and she was married to Anderson. I can't think of which Anderson he was, but anyway, I never knew him. He died when my dad was 20 years old, had just completed 2 years at Georgia Tech, and had to drop out of school then because they didn't have enough money to support him. And they decided to move to Nashville, Tennessee. And my grandmother bought a large home that was sort of near Vanderbilt University. And she kept roomers there. And that was her income. And my father got a job with a coal and ice company. You had to use ice back then. There were they didn't have any electrical refrigerators. They would put the ice in there. And the coal was how they heated their houses. So that was his first job. And his siblings were younger. And they went on to school. And my father, he had a lot of energy. He found a good job with a roofing company. The Taylor Roofing Company in Nashville, and he was a good salesman, and he learned all about roofs and learned how to be an appealing salesperson, and let me see. So my mother, they met because my dad visited Aqua with his friends one weekend, and the people from Nashville would go down for weekends and enjoy. They had a swimming pool, they had bowling, they had lots of activities, a little lake for fishing, tennis courts. Back at the hotel, I had about 100 rooms. I remember it myself. It was a large clapboard hotel with 3 stories. And so he and a couple of friends spent the weekend there. And they happened to meet because there was a dance pavilion there. And they would have good orchestras come down and the young people love to dance, or maybe the old people too. I don't know. The 20s, the kind of dancing they did, that was fun to look at. And so they happened to meet there at the, my mother would go to the dances. I think she was about 16 and when they met, and she was introduced to my father. And they seemed to hit it off pretty well. And although he was 6 years older. And then her mother and daddy decided that she needed to go to Nashville to a better school than they afforded in the little country places. And so she went to Hume Fogg High School, which is still in Nashville on Broadway, right near the country music, all of that.
Yeah.
So they started seeing each other. She boarded with a nice family there, and they, I don't know how much. They probably started seeing each other quite a bit. And when she was 19, they married. She had graduated from high school, and they had a little wedding in my grandmother and grandfather's house, and and she had a lovely dress, which I've seen. Her little wedding dress was handmade out of white satin with little orange blossoms on it, and I've never seen the picture. Now, why they didn't, they should have had you there to record it. But anyway, they were happily married. My grandfather ran the country store there, and my grandmother served as a postmistress. And she liked to have a job out of the house. She'd raised 4 children and cooked all these meals, so she enjoyed her job as a postmistress. And anyway, so they of course lived in Nashville after that, and I think she went to Peabody and took some classes. She didn't graduate, but they lived in the house that my grandmother, Mama Annie, was taking care of. They had a room there. And let me see, for 6 years they lived there, and my mother wanted to have their own place, so Daddy worked hard and made the money to build a house. And it was on 2812 Hillside Drive, which is right near Natchez Trace, the nice hill. I think there were about 4 or 5 houses to begin with when they were there, and all that developed later. And they picked out the nicest lot, and you could see Vanderbilt University sometimes from that house because it was perched up on the top of the hill. Let me tell you, what else do I need to tell you about them?
Yeah, so that's very cool. So I'd love to hear more about your parents, both individually. Maybe we'll start with your father and what kind of man he was, what his background was, where he grew up, and you already talked about him as a salesperson, and he had a really great energy about him.
Right.
I'd love to hear more about, kind of his background, what brought him to be that way, and kind of the man he was to you as a father growing up.
Well, I don't know a lot about, but he was, they worked they had a farm, but his daddy had a stock trading business with cattle and horses, and he would spend time going to Atlanta to the markets there and trading, and that's how he really prospered and did well. And it was such a shock when he died of a heart attack when he was so young,
So can you tell about that story as well? Is that the story where the doctor came and thought it was a stomach issue?
Okay.
Could you tell that story?
So he felt really badly. His stomach was bothering him. He was actually having a heart attack, and they got a doctor with him, and the doctor said, you just need your stomach pumped out. and my Aunt Evelyn, my aunt, said, she was talking to him then, he said, Evie, I think they're killing me, pumping my stomach out. And of course the doctor did what he thought was right, and it was not, stomach problem, it was a heart attack. And then he passed away that day sometime. I don't know any details. My dad never told me that story, and Evelyn did.
And how old was your dad at that point?
And I don't know how old he was. My father was about 20, my daddy.
Yeah.
And just such a shock. He had been spending the summer with a summer job on a freighter out of Milan to Italy, and he had just landed in New York and got the sad news.
So what kind of parent was your dad? Like, was he good cop, bad cop? Was he the more strict one? Was he more lenient? How did he parent you and Jimmy and family?
I guess you'd say sort of lenient.
Yeah.
It's funny, I don't ever remember being paddled or anything by either parent. They didn't believe in corporal punishment.
Interesting.
But he was out of the house a lot. I mean, later on he said he was sorry, but at night he would go calling on his prospects for roofs. He would come home, eat supper, and then he'd leave again. And what he would do in the daytime a lot, he would drive around different areas of Nashville and look at the roofs and see which ones he thought they needed to replace.
Yeah.
And then at night he'd go call on them and try to sell them a roof. Anyway, that would. So I didn't see him. My mother did most of the parenting, but if I wanted to do things later on, I was invited to a lot of out-of-town parties and dances at military academies. And I wanted to go to all those because I was 15, 16, 17. And I'd say, Daddy, can I go? And he'd say no. I said, Mother, can I go? Yes. And he was always agreed to it. I don't know whether that was just...
So I recall reading about you going to, was it a McCallie dance? And you went with a man named WC?
Yeah.
So what were those couple of years like?
Well, I enjoyed it. First of all, Evie and Norton, my aunt and uncle, and Humpy. Humpy was their only child. He was 3 years older than I am, and he was sort of like an older brother. And he had lived, when I was a little girl, I was visiting my grandmother, Mama Annie, which she's a treasured person. And she had to keep him for a while when he was in first or second grade. He had asthma, and they thought the Tennessee River was giving him problems. And so I loved playing with Humpy. I remember I was 4 or 5, couldn't wait for Humpy to come home, and we'd play Tarzan. And we'd pretend we were swinging on vines when we were swinging on the swing. Let's see. And so then they moved. Humpy went on back and lived as a child in Chattanooga, and then went to McCallie School. And when I became 14, he got me a date for a dance on the McCallie at the school. And it was an officer's ball. I was just dazzled because they had all these swords, and they made a place where people would walk through, where all the swords were, like the officers. So I met a boy named W.C. Bowling, and meanwhile, the next year they moved to back to Nashville, and Humpy, I think, entered Vanderbilt then. But I kept, W.C. would invite me down to a lot of dances, and I would stay with his parents, which were very nice.
That's great.
And anyway, I love the uniforms.
That's great.
And they don't wear uniforms at those schools anymore. Mm-hmm. And they're integrated, I think, with girls.
Yeah.
No military.
Right.
So
I'd be curious to hear about your mother as well. So what is her background? What kind of upbringing did she experience, and how did she parent you as a child? Well,
when I read a book that she wrote, a baby book, and she said she thought I was very wonderful, and says, I will never want to spank her. I bet she did later. But both parents just expected us to behave, and back in those days, children tried to behave more than they do today, I think, and please their parents. And but they might sneak around and do a few things the parents didn't know about. But she was devoted to her home and her family. As a little girl, she had a sister like Aunt Mom with her one sister, and another one, Aunt Doris. And so they were the 3 sisters, and then there was a younger brother who was about 8 years old when she married, Uncle Hiram. And she, of course, grew up in that family, that country atmosphere, and they had a lot of freedom to play around the community. You wouldn't worry about criminals in that era. They would be free to run around and go to other houses and do whatever they wanted to. Let me see, I just remember her saying that her her father, that was Mr. Ed Potts, built them a nice little play area, like a little park behind the house, and he was a very industrious person, and he, in fact, I think he built the house by himself, well, a 2-story big house, and but his main business was running the store, and he made quite a bit of money running the store because people didn't have cars and they couldn't go to Dixon, Tennessee, or one of the old towns, and I have happy memories of him. And I was 10 years old when he died, which was sad. But let me see what of the background they had was just sort of a country background, and they had their grandparents were very indulgent. I remember them talking about Mr. and Mrs. Biddle were the great-grandparents, my great-grandparents, and I guess they used to spend a lot of time. That was at the hotel. They would let the whole the community use their swimming pool, other things. They were very indulgent, and I'm trying to think of what else. But she went to the little country school, which was still there when I used to visit my grandparents, and it had about 2 or 3 rooms, and they would put maybe 2 or 3 grades together. And when I was just staying there in the summertime, I decided one time, well, I think I'll go to the school and see what that's like, because they started school in about July or August. They had to help with the crops in that area, and I had that experience. She told me about the school. They didn't have restroom facilities. They had a place, the boys went to the bathroom in the woods, one area, and the girls in another area. Can you imagine? And of course they would have maybe about 2 or 3 grades in the same classroom. And I experienced that. I went 2 or 3 days. I went to the school and just to see what it was like, and tried to do what they did. Everybody took their lunches and sack lunches. They didn't have any lunchrooms.
Interesting. And so you said your parents got married at your grandparents' house.
That's
is that right?
It was a nice big house, and they just had the family and close friends there. Mm-hmm.
That's incredible. And so what was their marriage like from your memory?
I think they were very happy. I think they were in love all of their lives, and everybody has little disagreements, but they were basically just had a very, very happy marriage. And,
yeah, that's great. Really, anything you want to share about maybe after your childhood going on into Vanderbilt, meeting Charles, and I know you said you met him in a freshman math class, is that right?
Right,
I'd love to hear about that and your first few interactions with Charles, and how everything blossomed from there.
Well, let's see. Let me talk about our little family life a little bit. Now, the Depression in Nashville affected everybody. I mean, all over the country. And it wasn't, in 1928, things had been good, and I think it took a while to get to Nashville, and people started feeling the effects of it. During that time, my father, the business was having problems. Uncle Carroll had joined the Leon Taylor Roofing Company, and they, and then Mr. Taylor, both of them had trouble with alcohol, and my dad did not, and he had to drop away from that, and they were having problems, so he started his own company called the Southern Roofing Company, and for a while they really had to struggle, and they didn't have very much money, and they needed to pay the mortgage on the house, and my mother decided to keep boarders in the house, and so we had 4 bedrooms, and we would have maybe 4 boarders at a time. There were some 2 or 3 of them were ladies who worked downtown in Nashville. They had no cars. They would drive there, ride the bus, which stopped at the foot of the hill, and go down to the Cade Sloan's, Caston, these downtown, everybody, that's where people shopped. They didn't have malls and so forth. Anyway, I had my own bedroom to begin with, and I had to give that up to a boarder. And Mother and Daddy had their own bedroom, and they gave that up to boarders. At one time, we were all sleeping in one bedroom. My brother and I, he must have been 3 or 4, and I guess I was, I don't know, whatever, 6, 12, 10 maybe, 8 or 10. And I really resented that. I did not want to sleep with my brother. And I made him put his head at the other end of it was a little day bed, one little narrow day bed, and I put my pillow on one end, and he had to keep his head at the other end. And I remember that well. And Daddy had built an extra bedroom after we had moved there, which was downstairs, and so we rented that out. And Mother charged them $25 a month, and she fed them breakfast and supper and had the bedroom for them for $25 a month. And that was standard back then, and she made enough money for us to live on and pay the mortgage.
Yeah.
She was a hard worker, and she was very neat, and I'm not. I wish I were. But she would keep her house just spotless. You remember that, Ann? How my mother would keep the house. And I would always, when she would visit me in Birmingham, I would really have to get busy and clean to be presentable.
Yeah. So what were times like during the Depression? I mean, what was the overall feel of just everything going on? Did you feel shielded, or did you feel like you were very in tune with everything going on in the country at the time?
Well, of course, they kind of shielded Jimmy and me, but they didn't complain a lot about the conditions and how they were. But my father, when he got out of the roofing business, he bought a rock wool insulation business and made some money that way. And then one night it caught fire. And I remember my mother being so upset he had to go down where it was in some nearby town. And she was heartbroken, and I remember her crying, sitting on the steps that go upstairs and just sitting there and just crying. I never saw her cry very much. She wasn't much of it. But that was a heartbreaking time. And I suppose, but then Daddy started the roofing company, and after a struggle, it started prospering. And she told me that she had, my father, I'm trying to think of which story, she had been trying to buy an Oriental rug and saving her money, and she finally saved $100, and they had this beautiful rug she wanted to buy, and she was ready to spend it, and he told her, no, we might need that money, it would be weird. And things like I didn't have many clean, new clothes as a child. Mm-hmm. And in 4th or 5th grade, we started, one of the main activities was going to a skating rink. And the whole classes would have everybody wanted to have their birthday party there and skate. And I didn't have any proper skating clothes. You just had to have these little flared skirts, and they didn't wear slacks and pants. And I was wanting one so much, and I remember one wonderful Christmas I was given a little skating skirt that was navy blue, just little things like that, show you how. And I had a bicycle that my Uncle Hiram had given me that was a kind of a small red bicycle that he was no longer using. And I rode on that. I remember going down the hill flying one day, and the brakes wouldn't work, and I couldn't stop it. And here was Blair Boulevard and Natchez Trace there. I don't know, do you remember Natchez Trace? And intersected the road. And I flew across there. If there'd been a car coming, I guess I would have gotten hurt and healed. But just little things like that. And so for my next birthday, I got a new bike. It wasn't new. They looked in the pages of the newspaper one as, and I found a bike that they could afford.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
I was
That had
thrilled.
working brakes.
Yeah, that had brakes.
So despite that, part, what were your favorite memories from childhood?
Oh, I think my favorite memories, a lot of them. Of course, I loved being with my family. We had a nice side porch that went off of our living room, and at night we would go out and sit on this big swing. And your dad got that swing when that was his inheritance.
Yeah.
He loved that swing too, and you could see in the distance. You could see there wasn't no house right next to us with a beautiful view of Nashville, and at night my father would tell stories or something, and we would sit out there, and that was a family time. That was fun.
That's great.
And let me see, and of course I always I liked to climb trees when I was a little girl, and my neighbors across the street, I had four. They had 4 girls, and one was my age, but she wouldn't climb trees with me.
Yeah. So what did you want to be when you grew up? Did you have?
I didn't have any. I got entranced with music. I started taking piano at the age of 6, and the piano lessons were $1 each, and we didn't have much money, but my mother would always find the $1 for those piano lessons.
That's incredible.
And at one time, I guess the story about your brother kicking did I anyway,
I'm not sure I know
when
that
I would
story.
be practicing at night, and he didn't want to hear it, and he would lie under the piano. It wasn't this piano, but it was another this type of piano, and he would lie under there and kick the piano. and he told me later on he hated to hear me practice, but it got him to really enjoy classical music.
That's so funny. Did you play any other instruments, or did you just play piano?
I just played the piano. I always thought it'd be fun to take the violin, but we didn't have money for other things.
Yeah.
And my teacher would have recitals for us. It seemed like all the time. I was sick of recitals, and it would make me nervous to have to play before people. They would have a little chair set up in their living room.
Yeah.
And I didn't like that. Another story. My brother, Jimmy, I had this. We had an old-time Victrola that played records, and somehow there was an Enrico Caruso disc, what do you call it, the record, and I would play it over and over. And your dad hated that. No, your granddad hated that. One day I came and I wanted to play my record, and someone had taken a pencil and scribbled all over it and totally ruined it. And I know who did it. He would never admit it. Jimmy never.
So was Jimmy a troublemaker at all?
Oh, I know he was a sweet brother, but we would go chasing each other around the house. Touch your life. I touch your life. And sometimes we would have fun at night. There was a porch right off of my bedroom, and it was over the flat roof there over the garage, and we would make a pallet with the quilts and all, and lie out there and watch the stars.
I'd love to hear more about Jimmy. I'd love to hear who he was, especially as a child. I got to know him in his later years, but I'd love to hear what he was like as a brother, as a son, what you guys like to do as kids as you were growing up, and anything you'd like to share about Jimmy.
Yeah. Well, Jimmy came along when I was 6 years old, and it was a shock. Somebody else was in the family that they were paying attention to. But, and so I was not too fond of him for a few months, and I got acquainted with him as a baby. And as a little boy, he was very venturesome, and seemed like my mother was always having to take him to the hospital to get something sewed up. There was a crowbar in our garage, and he managed to pull it down on himself and broke his hand, I believe.
Oh my goodness.
I remember there was a hawthorn bush with a sharp, it was briars, and he got himself cut with those horse horns and had to go get sewed up. And the worst thing was he decided he would investigate the electrical outlets with a knife. And he stuck a table knife into the outlet, and bang, it was lucky he didn't really get hurt. I'm sure he had a shock. And the knife was melted on the end.
How old was he when that happened?
Like 3 or 4 or 5. I don't know. I just know it was a very scary thing to happen, and he learned about outlets though very quickly. And we would use that knife when we would eat dinner, and we'd tell the story about how it got melted.
So do you think his frequent visits to the hospital played a factor in him wanting to be a doctor later in life?
I doubt that. I don't know what. And coming up, he loved to make model airplanes with balsa wood and covered with tissue paper. And this was he was beyond his skills. And he would go to the dime store and talk his mother into buying another airplane to make, and she would buy it for him. And then he would work on it for hours and hours, and then he'd get discouraged and just cry. He'd just leave it and cry. He couldn't finish it. One time I said, "Well, I'm going to show him how to do that," and I actually put one together, but I never got along to finish it. It was a difficult job. But he loved airplanes. And I guess at that time, maybe he liked cars too, but it seemed to me that whatever he wanted, my mother would buy for him when she wouldn't always buy me things. But we started being very companionable, and he was a very sweet young child. I've got some beautiful pictures of him, if I can find for you, as a child. And we learned to play together, and we would both visit Aqua when we were children, and we would enjoy the companionship there. Now we had 2 cousins we played with a lot. I had a cousin named Nancy Thrower, my Aunt Maud's child, and then Aunt Maud had a little boy, and his name was John Thrower. And particularly we went to visit my grandparents. We would play together in the yard, play together. It was fun to have other kids to play with. I don't know. I guess perhaps we would go to the Aqua Springs, and there was a beautiful little creek you could wade in that was good for little children. We'd spend time there. And in the swimming pool, we would spend time. It was very cold water, though. You wouldn't want to stay in there but a few minutes. It was a spring-fed swimming pool. And we liked, as we grew older, we liked to go and explore the old hotel. And it was owned by Mr. and Mrs. White, and they still lived in a portion of the hotel upstairs. And now and then they would rent out a few rooms for people that wanted to spend a weekend there. And they would let us have the range of the hotel, and we would just go and look at all of these rooms, these 100 rooms, and they still had the furniture. And I remember they had wash basins and pitchers, and they always put a pitcher of water from the mineral springs in each room. The hotel was it was a beautiful place. The second floor had all of these verandas, and I remember taking my bike and riding all around the verandas, and there was a little stream behind. Just a beautiful place. But one time, Deola, who was the owner's daughter, and became a good friend to me, and she helped me learn how to swim. And one time we were walking in the dark from my grandparents' home, about a half a mile down to the hotel, and she told me a story about how there was someone said that there was a person or a personality that lived on the 3rd floor, and someone had seen it, and that but that they would never tell what they had seen, and I believe this story that there was some kind of an evil personality that lived up on the third floor. So I had Humpy was with me visiting, I think, and anyway, the four of us, Nancy, John, Jimmy, and I, went up to the top floor, and we kind of crept around, and we heard a sound, a weird sound down the hall in one of the rooms, and we decided we better leave, and in a panic we all flew down those steps and out of the hotel, and never went up to the third floor again. We don't know, but there was some evil thing up there.
My gosh.
That was one of the things. It was fun.
That's funny.
Let me see, trying to think of other things.
Yeah, so moving on to Jimmy as a teenager, obviously he went to NBA, eventually won the Gentleman Scholar Athlete Award there. What was he like as a teenager, and what were his motivations? What was
he was always ambitious to make good grades, and I think he made top grades, and he liked being, he was determined he wanted to be on the football team, and he was underweight, and I remember one summer, maybe it was between the junior and senior year, or sophomore and junior year, he spent all summer drinking about 4 quarts of milk every day and trying to build himself up. And he did get on the team. He was the center of the team. And another thing that he liked to do, Daddy bought him an old car that he could try to rebuild and make it usable. And a lot of his teenage friends, they would spend every afternoon out in the garage trying to tinker with that car. And I don't know whether they got it running or not. It was not great.
Yeah.
My mother and Daddy made him do chores, and he had to cut the grass. And there were 2 acres around our house in Woodbine. And I remember, I've got a picture of him mowing that grass. He hated that job.
So then moving forward to college, did he always want to go to Vanderbilt, or?
I don't know whether we ever questioned it. I was going to Vanderbilt. I'd go to Peabody Demonstration School in high school. And I loved it. It was a small private college, and not prep school. And I just remember that I believe he and Jimmy was put into Peabody when he was 6th or 7th grade, and he was playing in a band, and I remember he played a trumpet, and my mother and Dad decided to put him in MBA, I don't know, 8th or 9th grade, and he didn't want to leave Peabody. He loved it, and he was so bad he gave up the trumpet. I'm not sure whether MBA had a good band or not. And,
so what was MBA like at that time? What was its reputation, and what was the campus like? What was, if you had to describe MBA in that time?
Well, of course I didn't spend a lot of time there. I remember that neither Jimmy or I had a car, and of course maybe this was before he would drive himself. He would call me in the afternoon when I'd gotten back from Vanderbilt trying to study, and I'd get irritated because he had a bus there he could get home on, and I would give him, could you come pick me up? And I'm sure I would do that, but he was, I know he was a good scholar, and I remember when he was a little boy, one of his teachers saying that he had an encyclopedic mind, and as a child he used to get our encyclopedias and just read them. So he always was very smart, and I had a better memory than I did. And
yeah, that's incredible.
I think that he maybe conceived the idea of wanting to be a doctor when my father had a heart attack when he was 57 years old, and Jimmy and I would take turns staying with him, and it was at the old St. Thomas Hospital. And I think that interested him in the medical field.
Interesting.
And
So where did his love of duck hunting come from? Was that early on?
That
Was
I
that
don't
later?
know. And he loved to take canoe trips on the Duck River, different rivers, and he and his friends would all. I don't know, they had another canoe, but they would go and spend a couple of days on the river and cooking their food and so forth. And I remember him telling about one time they were there in their tents, and it was a downpour, and the river was rising, and they had to rise, and they nearly could have drowned, had to pick up everything and leave. But
Is this when he was in high school? Or how?
yeah, I think high school days.
So your parents would just let him go do what he needed to do, and
That's
just
right,
pray
and
that he
they
would
would-
come back in one piece?
Yeah, but he was. And I remember my Fifi telling me about the time that he was duck hunting, and he had his boat, and he went over to another island to try to have luck, and the boat floated away when he was not watching, and he was stranded on this island, and somehow somebody found out about him and rescued him, but for a while she didn't know where he was. And I think the boat floated down the river, and they actually found it, and they were worried that he'd drowned, but thank goodness he was safe then.
Yeah, that's incredible. So to go back to Vanderbilt and to pivot back to you and your life, so you met Charles in a freshman year math class.
That's right.
How did that happen? Did he approach you? Did you approach him?
Well, what it
How?
was, I had a good friend, Milber Jackson, and we were sitting on the front row. I like to pay attention so I can make my A's. And so then these two boys sat behind us that we didn't know, and they were not interested in study. That was Charles, and then a friend of his, Jim Rich Roberts from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and Charles he was very naughty. He would tap on my shoulder, and when I was trying to study, and ask me questions, and he would pull my hair, and Mira and I just said, those two boys are ridiculous. I wish they would move.
That's so funny, but he got your attention, I guess, right?
He got my attention, and he buttered up the teacher. He was good in math. That was one of the things he was good in. He was not a good student. He was not a good Spanish student, not a good English student. But
so how many years after that did you two get married?
well, we dated 4 years, but I still had other boyfriends. Back in those days, you tried to get as many boys as you could, so you
Sure.
could go to different fraternity dances.
Yeah.
And until our senior year, and I was dating a boy from Iowa that was really nice. And anyways, Charles was just always around, and I got to say, well, he is nice to have. I can ask him to do things, and he'll do it. One day I lost my books. I was in a classroom in the afternoon, and I was waiting for my mother to come pick me up. And so I put my books on a car parked out front, not thinking that car would move, and went in to call her. And when I called her, she says, "Catherine Ann, do you know you have my car keys in your purse?" And so I rushed out, and here my books had gone, the car. And I called Charles, and of course he came and helped me, and we found them scattered all over the campus. But he was handy to have around.
So how did Charles eventually propose to you?
Well, I guess it was just, I don't know whether it was just gradual that, we saw each other quite a bit. He had me come and visit his parents here. And I guess this must have been this junior year. And he took me out to a place a piece of property, about 20 acres, that was on the edge of Mountain Brook, and people used to. There was it kind of was a lover's lane. People would park there from time to time, It was just an overgrown road, but it was an interesting, pretty piece of property, and so and we drove. He showed me that, and then I think about then is where he kind of proposed. He didn't kneel down. He never did that.
Yeah, and where did you two get married? Where was the wedding?
And so then the senior year, I accepted his fraternity pin, and just dated him, and we decided to get married in September after we graduated from Vanderbilt, and. So in May we graduated, and in September we got married at the Methodist Church that's right across from Vanderbilt.
Cool. So one of the stories I thought was most fascinating was, I guess, a little bit after that period when you two went to New Orleans, and the story with
my grandmother.
Yes,
and we had taken Anne and her older sister must have been about 2 and 4, 3 and 5 or something like that. They were young, and dropped them up there, and had driven on to New Orleans, and for 2 or 3 days. And coming back, the roads were not good, so we spent the night in Memphis in the motel. And during the night, Charles said, "Mama," to back up, she was well and doing well, and had come over for dinner the night before we left, and we had seen her, and so she said, "Well, Mama Annie," and he always liked Mama Annie. She was a wonderful Christian person that influenced me greatly in my life of being a Christian. And said, "Mama Annie stood at the foot of the bed last night." And I said, "Well, that's impossible." And I said, she'd given me a message, and she said, "Take care of Catherine Ann." And I said, "Well, that's a crazy dream." But anyway, we drove to Nashville the next day and found that Mama Annie had indeed died that night, about midnight, of a stroke, a sudden heart attack, stroke. And I said, "Why?" And we didn't understand all that, but it was quite an experience, and so we stayed there for the funeral and all. But she was a big influence in my life because of her faith. Absolutely. And we decided later, I said, "Well, why didn't she speak to me?" And he said, "Well, I guess she wanted to tell me to take care of you." So that was one story.
That's really sweet. So obviously you and Charles had a very successful marriage since then. What do you think is the secret to a successful marriage, to love, to keeping it going for 68 years?
Well, you just hang in there. And things change from time to time, and children change, and you have crises, and we went through some crises with our older daughter, but everything turned out well. Yeah. And with a lot of prayer.
Yeah.
And anyway, there was an incident when Charles really believed that the Lord took care of us as a family. One night we were driving to Gatlinburg, and we were from Maryville to Cades Cove. The road has been windy, and we were anxious to get up and set up our tent. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and he had increased his speed, and he said a car came toward him without lights, speeding, and he heard a voice said, "Charles, pull over." And he did, and this car came within a few inches of hitting us. And he thought the Lord had really taken care of us, so that was his belief, little incidences like that.
Wow. So to get into your faith and his as well, where did your faith start? How has your faith journey been throughout your life? Well,
it started really with Mama Annie. I used to spend the night with her, and I'd stay in a little bed in her room. And she had the habit of sitting in bed, reading her Bible, and then getting on the floor and praying. So I've tried to imitate her. I would read my Bible when I was old enough to read, and then I would kneel down by the bed like she did. And I'd pray, and I'd say, now lay me down to sleep. My prayers were kind of short, and she would pray a long time. But I just formed that habit. Went through my teen years, really praying for things and feeling like the Lord was close. And it increased during the years. You know, if you're a Christian, you keep seeking more. When I was at Vanderbilt, I felt I'd like to get closer to the Lord. I asked one of those professors, and he said, how do you really get closer to God and feel His presence? And he said, oh, read this book about prayer or that. I didn't get any really good answers, but I was still seeking. And and Charles, and we went to church all the time, Methodist church. And Charles started going with us. He wanted to be wherever our family was. And so on Sundays we would go to West End and then go to dinner. My parents, they were not very open about their faith, so I didn't really share with them. Like Mama Annie, she was the one that was really sure that the Lord was going to take care of everything.
Yeah.
But the things just happened later on in life, and we joined the Methodist church here when we established our home here, and just went all the time and did all the jobs. He was chairman of the board. I was United Methodist Women. I was their president, and you know how you do those things. Mm-hmm. But we met a person named Tommy Tyson. He was a Methodist evangelist from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and he spoke at our church in different places. And he greatly influenced our lives too, that Jesus became more real to us through that. And I went to a camp called Camp Farthest Out, CFO, that was a family camp that would meet here, 30 miles from here at a conference center. And that influenced our lives. It influenced Ann's and Catherine's, I think, this camp, because it centered on prayer and believing that prayer really is real.
Yeah.
And
that's fantastic.
It was that through the years, lots of experiences.
Yeah.
So
who have been the most impactful people in your life?
Well, in mine, I guess Mama Annie, and then my grandparents, particularly my grandmother. I called her Mama Potts. And Papa Potts, he was always busy in his store, so I didn't try to bother him. He was a very successful businessman.
Now, he had multiple stores, right? Because he had a grocery store, the garage.
Yeah,
and then,
and there was a blacksmith shop back there, and he owned land, and he was he kept buying land and all of that. And there was a man in the a young boy who wanted to go to college, and he couldn't go to college, and so he loaned him some money, and he went off, and he became a successful auditor of a firm in New York City later on, and made a lot of money. And he came back and said, "Mr. Ed, I could not have gone to college had you not helped me." He would do kind things for people like that with his money. And the little stores lost their effectiveness later on, because people would go to the bigger stores in town surrounding there. He said, so anyway, that was fun. And Daddy's business had prospered, and Jimmy and I sat in the back seat, and they sat in the front seat, and they would go looking for antiques, like glassware and stuff. And we had this huge box between us. I'd shove it his way, he'd shove it my way.
That's great.
We got, and he always seemed. You haven't started the thing.
I went ahead and started since you were talking about Jimmy.
Yeah. And he was always seemed to be interested in me, and when I would go out at dances, high school, and had all these fraternities and sororities in those days, and he would say, She asked Mother, did Catherine Dan get a rush? A rush is when all these boys want to dance with you.
Oh yeah. Now there used to be dance cards. Is that right?
Right, and we had a little cards. I've got them in my scrapbook, which I've lost. They're around here somewhere. And they would put different boys. There'd be no breaks, and you would dance with the boys longer then. And I used to go to fraternity dances at Swanee. Had a wonderful place up there. And then at Castle Heights, which was at Lebanon, I had a boyfriend there. And I was interested in him because we went on my family went to Cumberland State Park and spent the a week or so at the summertime, and I was about 15 or 16, and they had a big lake that you would actually get on a dock and dive into the water. And I met a boy named Sam McCarty. He was just sitting there. I wasn't particularly impressed with him, but we started talking, and then I found out he was a cadet major at Castle Heights High School the next year.
Oh wow!
So we started dating, and I thought he was, he was head of everything at Castle Heights, and I was impressed.
Yeah, that's great.
And that was fun. Anyway, and going to fraternity and sorority dances, they would start at 10 o'clock at night and last till 2, and then you'd go to somebody's house for a breakfast. I mean, you'd stay up all night.
Man.
And really? I don't think they had that at, did y'all have any sorority and fraternities in high school?
Not in high school.
Yeah, okay.
But you did?
Yeah. That was a big thing, and we would have all the dances at Bellman Country Club.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What was Bellman Country Club like back then?
Well, it was a wonderful place. They would rent the places out to us, and you'd have to have a new dress for every dance.
Yeah.
And there was a lady that made dresses for my age group, and you would just tell her what you wanted. She was so talented; she would just put it together. She made the wedding dress that Catherine is wearing. That I wore the wedding dress. Anne wore the same wedding dress, white satin. And
Ega even.
And Ega, and several family members had worn that dress, and I remember she charged $25 to make that with all seed pearls all over.
Oh my goodness.
Well, prices were just amazing back then.
Yeah. We'll get to the grandparents and everything in a second. I want to stick on the Nashville thing for a second. So what was Nashville like when you were growing up, and what is it like now to see it as big and booming as it is today?
Yeah, you want me to tell you that? Are you going to have you go ahead and
yeah, we're already recording, so.
Oh no, I didn't know
we can restart and start talking about Bon Aqua and the grandparents.
Okay. The one thing you remember was the atmosphere. Everybody heated their houses with coal. And it was very, very smoky in the morning, foggy and smoky. I remember waking up and you couldn't see the houses across the street. It was thank goodness for natural gas that's come in.
Really?
People of my age didn't normally have their own cars, and they would maybe drive their parents' cars. I never had a car till I married, and my father gave me I think it was a blue Plymouth that I used for years, but I had access to my mother's car and would drive it.
So what was the process to get your driver's license?
What was what?
How did you get your driver's license back in the day? Did you have a driver's license?
Yeah, I think I did. When I turned to be 16, my daddy, and we were at Cumberland State Park then, and he gave me, because I was 16, he started giving me driver's lessons. I think he gave me one or two, and that was it. He thought I could drive it. I had a few bunged up fenders. I remember backing out and hitting somebody's car, and Daddy and it was somebody Daddy knew. He was embarrassed. He had to pay to get the fenders fixed.
So here's a little segue into your grandparents. So I remember a story about Papa Potts and Mama Potts getting stuck in the middle of a back road creek of sorts.
No, it was my mother and Daddy and I were in this car.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay.
And back then, you would just go ahead and cross a creek they didn't have the money for bridges. I mean, if you be sure it was usually not very deep. And we went, I remember Mother saying, Jim, I don't think we ought to cross this creek. Oh, it'll be all right. So we drove on into the creek, and in the middle, the car died. And my mother and I she was fussing at him.
She didn't let him forget that one.
And Daddy got out of the car and waded back to the shore, and then found some farmer who had a mule. And the mule got us out, and I think he was a little more careful about creeks. But the roads were the back roads were very muddy and had a lot of, just ditches in them.
Yeah. So moving on into your grandparents, Papa Potts, Mama Potts. Mm-hmm. Let's start with Edwin Potts and his businesses. Mm-hmm. What do you remember of him? What was his personality like, and what kind of impact did he have on you and the grandchildren?
Well, I was usually with my grandmother. Now the store was a large store, and they had a part of it set off for the post office, and I would sit there with my grandmother, and she would go in and do the store had a nice candy case with a glass window with Hershey bars, Milky Ways, any kind of candy you could think of. And she would get me a big Hershey bar. They cost 5 cents then, a huge Hershey bar. And then she would make it, use the tinfoil. We would eat the Hershey. I would share that. And it was covered with aluminum foil or something like tinfoil. And she would fashion on paper cups made out of the foil and little goblets. And then she would get Coke, and I would drink that. But anyway, she was just, I would stay with her, and she would let me stamp the Aqua stamp on the mail outgoing. And I remember one time I was, she said, well, don't let your grandfather see you get candy, just wait till he's out of sight. And he had horseshoes for sale, he had big feed sacks, and fertilizer, all sorts of farm implements. He had shoes, he had a place of shoes, he had a place that sold, in his store that sold dry goods, cloth, and that people would buy and make their own clothes. And he had there was a little chest, Coates and Clark, that held all sort of spools of thread, and I have that in my house. It's something that my mother took when they died, and I made a little chest out of it to keep her silverware in, and I treasure that as a memory. And his store and had a big black cast iron big stove in the center of the store, and in the wintertime the people would come in and sit around there. That would be their gathering place and tell stories and all. In the summertime there were some nice benches on the front porch of the store, and that was another gathering place. They'd sit out there, and the men that were all retired and had nothing else to do, or maybe smoking their cigars, they would sit out there and chat. And it was and he had of course his was the only filling station, which was right up the way. So there were a lot of activities going on. He got interested in trading the commodities. I remember he would buy dogwood wood lumber and they would buy it from him and send it to England, and they would make the barrels for the whiskey they made over there out of dogwood. And Mother and Dad told him about one time he bought a whole carload of peanuts, and then for some reason he had a hard time getting rid of all those peanuts. but he would make money. And one of the things, he was kind of distant. He was just a typical grandfather that I was kind of a bother maybe being around there, staying around so much. And one time I was put some of those horseshoes on my feet and started clogging around, and he fussed at me. So I never took food with his horseshoes again. And then we got an ice cream. He got an ice cream machine later when, and so he would say, now, you can have an ice cream cone, just one a day. And so I would fill it with ice cream, and then I wouldn't carefully use it again. When he wasn't looking, I'd fill it again. My dad was legal. It was just an ice cream cone, one a day. But and he loved the Grand Ole Opry. I remember that about him. On Saturday nights, he would close the store, and the Grand Ole Opry was just, he loved that music. And WSM, it was, they didn't have TVs, but they loved the radio. And I remember every room in the house had there was no central heating. We had fireplaces in every room. And in the wintertime, our room was right next to the living room, and Nancy, Thor, and I would go to bed, and they had big feather beds and to keep you warm, lots of quilts. And I would hear them start. He loved to play rook. He wouldn't play with regular cards. He called them spot cards, and they were evil. But they would have family. My aunt and uncles would be there, and my mother and daddy, and they would enjoy the companionship around that car with their cards. And I could hear him cackle. He loved to get the rook or whatever. Do you remember the game of rook?
Oh yeah, I've heard of rook before.
He loved to play it, and he would get a sack of candy he would bring from the store to treat everybody, and my grandmother would make a dishpan this big full of popcorn.
That's great.
And but we would go to sleep in we loved seeing the fire, it die down slowly and reflect on the ceiling. I mean, that's kind of a happy time. And my grandmother she made wonderful meals. She was a wonderful cook. She was a little bit heavy, but you could tell she loved to eat.
Yeah, so let's go into your grandmother then on that side as well. You kind of painted her a little bit as the good cop. Like when Papa Potts was telling you no, she would be a little more lenient and allow you to do things. Was that her personality overall, or what? How did you see her? And
Well, my mother remembered her as being a very stern parent, and giving and patting her. Somehow I was different. I was the first grandchild, and I was spoiled, very spoiled, and I could do most of what I wanted to do. I remember, I'm not sure they went to the Church of Christ, which is a very strict church, and she got upset with them because some mayor had an affair with somebody, and they cast him out of the church, and she didn't think they should have done that, and she mostly stayed home on Sunday mornings, but my grandfather kept going to this church all the time. I guess you know what the Church of Christ is. They're very strict on all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. They don't let you have a musical instrument in the church. They just sing. But my grandmother, my great-grandparents lived till I was 6 years old when they both died. And they lived across the street. And they just had that $1. Katy Metal Potts was her name. And my mother and Aunt Maud, every afternoon had the habit, they would go by the grandmother's place and she would treat them whatever they wanted to eat. She didn't have a refrigerator, but she had homemade biscuits and homemade preserves and jellies, and they would go get their treat, and they were very lenient. My mother was just crazy about her grandparents, and they seemed like really nice people. But I told her Mammy Biddle and Patty Biddle, and they went to the church every Sunday, and I would go. And Mammy Biddle would teach us. I remember being about 5 years old, and her showing us pictures of the Bible stories and things. And then my mother tells a story that Mammy Bill showed me a picture of Jesus and said, "Who is that?" And I said, "I don't know who she is," because he had long hair. She was not very impressed with my training. But anyway.
Yeah, very cool. So while we're on that side of things, I would love to just hear about Bon Aqua, the family history behind it, what brought family to Bon Aqua, and the Bon Aqua Hotel going through different transitions to it burning down, to being rebuilt, and everything that, wherever you want to start about that.
Well, there was this Williams family that discovered it in the mid 19th century, I guess 18 something, before the war, and I think they started making a little a place of they started maybe selling the water, letting people drink that water. They discovered it there. And they built a nice home. Anyway, were you with me? I think that we went to Johnny Cash later on bought the store and this home where the Weems had lived a bit, and it was a nice big farm. And they several years ago, Charles and I discovered it and visited it, and then Johnny Cash made the residence into a sort of just a retreat for him to go to, and a nice quiet place to be. And he used the store, he remodeled it, it was falling down, and made it into a recording studio for a while. And it's still there, refurbished. It looks very nice now, but it was just about to fall apart when he did that. And
we took you there about 3 years ago. And
Ann and Barrett took me one time, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
And we got to see it, and it was really interesting.
She was able to walk around and say, "I used to play here, and I used to do this
Oh, that's
there."
so cool.
And this is where my mother used to. She was the postmistress, and she used to, have her little the letters and everything, and used to help
That
her
was
with
just
that.
wonderful. I mean, there was a big scale out there that they would weigh the sacks of feed and all. And I remember I was trying to get to weigh 90 pounds. I was so glad when I got to weigh 90 pounds. But and it was fun to see the big trucks come in from Nashville and bring them all of the supplies that they would sell. And then you could hear the blacksmiths and their hammers making all across the street. And I thought that was exciting to go watch the fire where they were making the horseshoes, shooting the horses, and then there was the garage across the street, and you could hear their thing. They would be changing tires, and it was just certain sounds that was fun. Then there'd be cows mooing in the meadows. I mean, you just remember different things like that.
Yeah.
And they had these wonderful trees that I could climb. They were maple trees, and I used to love to try. I would climb one of the trees was my favorite, and I liked to get away from my little brother and my little cousins, and to read. So I devised a way I would get up in that tree, and they were too little to reach the branches to get up there, and I'd take my supplies up. I'll take my books up, and I'd take snacks up, and I found a little place that I'd put some ropes around so it would be kind of a little nest that I could sit up there, and not they wouldn't bother me, and I could read. And I had a little sack of rocks up there because there was this neighbor boy. I was afraid he would come and bother me, and I was going to throw them at him if he ever came and bothered me. And so underneath the tree there was a bench, and my grandfather liked to sit on that bench, and one day he was sitting on it, and he looked up and saw this sack up there, and he didn't know what it was, so he pushed it with the stick, and it fell down with rocks all over his head. I'm sure. But I don't know.
That's
It's
great.
different
So
stories.
what were your favorite parts of Bon Aqua? Like, where are your favorite memories there? where did you especially appreciate going, and what did you appreciate doing?
Well, it was a huge yard around, and we as children, we would play around. Maybe we would have bicycles or tricycles, and my grandfather had some sidewalks made between the store. The back of the store was right on the front of the yard of the house, and he had some nice concrete sidewalks which were fun to skate on, and we liked to just roam around. There was a chicken house down a ways down the hill from where they would have the hens laying the eggs. I remember as a child going and looking at those eggs, and sometimes we would gather the eggs for the family. And one time I was playing there, and this big rooster came up and attacked me, and that was not a good. He scared me to death. So I was afraid of roosters from then on. But I remember when we would want some chicken for dinner, you'd go out there and the chickens were running loose in the front yard too. And they would take one and ring its head. That was, and I didn't. And then it turned out to be really good to eat. But I hated to see the poor chicken getting killed. And at the time they had a big black pot where they would put boiling water and put the clothes in that. Later on they got the modern washing machine. There was no such thing as a dryer. They would have to hang clothes up there, and but they would boil them in this pot.
Yeah.
Sorry. I see, and you asked, and there was a stable down where they kept a cow, just one cow, for milk, and I remember trying to milk that cow, which that it was hard to do, but other people had to do that. And let's see, we just had a big yard to run around in and play in, and there were pigs down the way. They kept some pigs, and I remember they would. It was kind of yucky, but they would keep all the dishwater that they washed dishes, and they would put scraps in there, and that was slop that they would take it down and feed the pigs. And that I didn't think that was anything I wanted to participate in. And they would make butter, and that was fun. Kind of the using this plunger, and you've seen a place where you make butter. I don't know. You put the milk in there, the whole milk, and I guess you get the cream. Maybe you skim the cream off and then make the butter out of that. That was fun. And my grandmother had a stove in there in her kitchen, a great big iron stove, and she loved it. And she would put a little kindling in there to get it hot, and she loved to cook on that stove. She also had an electric stove on the other side, but she didn't like that. She wouldn't use it.
That's cool. So if you could go back to yourself as a child or in your teenage years, what would you go back and tell yourself?
Back and tell myself.
Anything. It could be life advice or...
I would maybe wish that I'd studied harder. I'd made good grades and I was able to get in college. I didn't make straight A's, but likewise I was able to make Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude, but I could have made better grades if I had been more diligent. But Charles took a lot of time. We would go to the library, and I'd be trying to study, and he'd just be talking. Charles, be quiet. I need to study. So I learned I couldn't study with him.
That's great. So I want to get into Mama Annie. I know she had a big impact. We've got 4 minutes left here, so if you don't mind,
Goodness
maybe take a
gracious,
quick
Mama
break.
Annie was just the sweetest person in the world. I remember her. She never had a car. She didn't ever have much material possessions, and she lived later on in life. She lived with Aunt Evie in Chattanooga, and then back in Nashville, and she would. Aunt Evie would teach in McCallie school. I think she taught speech there, and she taught at MBA too.
Oh, really?
And she would keep house for her. She was a wonderful cook, and I remember the pound cake she would make and homemade bread and things like that. But I remember walking down and on the Nashville streets with Mama Annie. She would take me on the bus and we would go to the movies. And I saw the Snow White. I thought that was a wonderful stunt. The first one I did this, and she's the one that took me to see that. And I always thought there was going to be a prince on a white horse to come and pick me up. I guess Charles was that prince. But he really took care of me. He was a wonderful dog. I remember walking along the streets, and I didn't know all those people, and Mama Annie would look at them. I didn't like to look at them because I didn't know whether they were looking at me, and she would look at people and just smile, and I said, "You don't know these people, Mama Annie." But she was just a sweet person to everybody she saw. And you know, just have somebody to love you and be interested in your life as a child. She was interested in my boyfriends, and he was interested in this. She was, as I said, I just know that she started me in my life of faith in the Lord, you know. And because maybe losing her husband at that early age, and she had lost a child. So many people had several children, and at least one of them was died. Mama Potts lost a little boy, but he was just a few months old. And I don't know what happened, but maybe some childhood disease, and Mama Annie, and but.
So what did she mean to you? And you know.
She was just, you know, somebody that loves you and is always interested in you. You're just gonna remember them and be attracted to them, and I hope my children remember how much I love them.
Yeah. I'm not, but you're telling some great things, so I just wanted to go ahead and press record again.
He got to know Bob, and he felt so grateful to have somebody in the family that could give him a little advice, and he worked in the bank for several years, did really hard labor. And then he decided to go out on his own, and he has a business of, he procures,
Investing.
What does he do? He buys investment. He helps the people that want to invest a lot of money. And he started out with dominoes, and they invested in a bunch of those. And then they went to, what all did they do?
Ice center.
The what?
Ice center, some kind of ice center, but he has a lot of dominoes now.
Dominoes, and then he's gotten into something,
now he has
into some others, and he's made a lot of money. And he recently, and his wife has a good job as an
commercial interior designer.
For commercial interior designer, and so they bought them. So he lives in a place he bought in Ponce de Leon Avenue or something, in an area that's a really nice cluster, condos.
Yeah.
And he found this place down in Greenville, near Greenville, Alabama, Georgia, near Greenville.
Plantation.
Yeah, it's not
Really?
Historic
This big White House built in 1850 or something, a historical place with about 50 acres, and they bought that recently and are trying to, you know, they need it. It was updated somewhat with the Sebastians and things, and and he's raising llamas.
Really?
He's going to raise cows.
They have baby goats coming in a couple weeks.
Wow.
Llamas and what are those other things?
Goats. He's getting
Some
baby
kind of
goats
goats.
in a few weeks. We're gonna go visit them in July.
Wow.
The
But,
goats and Richard.
Yeah.
And they're in there. They're the age is about mid-30s or something, and they're still. I'd like for you to get to know them sometime.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And the funny thing is, his features resemble a picture that I have of my grandfather that died, Mama Annie, and I never really knew. I never knew my grandfather, but he looks like his features look like he's a very fair skin and kind of light hair, and his eyes look just, isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Like the family resemblance things would come down in that area.
Yeah, very cool. So just to zoom out a little bit, and what would you know, what advice would you give to anybody, you know, maybe in my position as a 29-year-old, or just about life in general, and maybe somebody's watching this, you know, 10 years, 20 years down the road that you'd like them to know about the family, or
Now, is this re-recorded, or is this just talking?
this is recording. right
Oh,
now.
are you recording? Or
Yeah, so I'm just
Okay.
curious, any advice that you would give, or, just on life in general, like what your favorite moments have been throughout life, and kind of reflecting on life, what, you know, you wish you knew at a younger age, or what you would advise, you know, somebody like me.
I think the most important thing is to try to through prayer, and I think the Lord will really, that's been the basis of but in my life, that I just felt that from the time I was a teenager, just praying for different things. About Uncle Hiram was in the Battle of the Bulge, and I loved him because he helped me to learn how to ride my bike and do different things. Uncle Hiram was about 8 years older than I, and of course he was in the war, and he did not want to kill people, so they made him a medic. And he had an ambition to be a doctor later on. And over there, I think it really changed him. He had terrible experiences. Like one time he was at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, I think he was helping a Belgian woman have a baby in a haystack because there were the artillery all around, and he helped her deliver this baby. And then not long after that, some bullets killed, or I guess it was the big missiles or something, killed the mother and the child. I mean, he just couldn't stand pain and suffering like that. And he was captured by the Germans and put in jail and for a while, and we got the message that he was missing in action. And I remember we were so horrified because he was a sweet person, and I loved him. And I remember kneeling by my bed all night long, just praying that he would be saved. And I knelt by my bed every night as a teenager, and they later got the news that he was in captivity, but he was later returned to the family. He was wounded during that battle, and he unfortunately became dependent upon alcohol, and that sort of ruined his life. But I still remember him as being a kind, sweet uncle, and I remember he loved reading Edgar Allan Poe, and when I would have a little stomach upset, he would make a pallet for me out under the trees and bring me grape juice and crushed ice. I remember that. And then he would sit down and read me Edgar Allan Poe stories that I loved. And so on different occasions, I prayed for things that I knew that the Lord had answered me. And I think that your prayer life is, and it's good if you could be with a group of Christians that believe like you do. I had a wonderful friend named Marilyn Garand, and we were in a prayer group together, and it just had been a lot to have the strength of a small group. You can rely on them praying for you, you pray for them. She died 2 days ago, and her funeral is today. She lived up in Cowan, Tennessee. And she was such a Christ-like person. You'd look at her face, and she just had a beautiful face because she was totally unselfish, and the Lord really ran her life. It's hard to know, but I do believe that if you're sincere in following Him, He will guide you. And I don't know what your goals are in life, or I think we start out not knowing. We just trying to survive and do the things that our parents tell us to do, and then later on you have to be your own guide. And I know that's the way you're living your life.
Yeah, very cool. So what was it like during that period with the war going on and people getting drafted into the war that you knew? What was it like during
Well,
that period
it's
of time?
amazing how oblivious we were as teenagers to all the tragedy that was going on in Europe, you know.
Yeah.
I think about it now that when we were at Vanderbilt, some of these veterans who would come back would have these stories. I remember hearing a man in our English class recount being on a ship and the guns and the hoping that ship was going to stay there, and fortunately he did come home. I have a friend named Emily Manchester, and she wrote a story about her brother that was a Vanderbilt student and went into the Navy, I think, and he was flying, and he lost, the airplane went down, and she lost him in the war, and you know, it would things like that would make it so real to you. But as a 14, 15, 16-year-old, now the thing was that boys that were in our classes, when they would graduate from high school, they would immediately be drafted. Well, I think when it's 18 years old, and I just guess being a girl, now we had things like we would collect aluminum for the war effort. We would different things, and they rationed food and just little things were, but they were just not anything compared to what the boys had to go through when they were drafted. And I was lucky that when I was a senior, I think that was the year that the war ended. And I went to Vanderbilt, and then all these boys came back. And Vanderbilt was a small school, and they didn't have enough dorm space for the boys. And the girls, generally, we just lived at home. And because there weren't Vanderbilt was just such a small campus. There was one, McCallie Hall was the one place where people would, girls from out of town would live. And I think that there were just about, this is a few thousand people who attended Vanderbilt then. And when Charles entered, they gave him the choice of living in the barracks. Some barracks had put up for them, and that they were going to build some new dorms. And so and they had one great big hall that was just very old and very creaky and just not a good place to stay. He didn't want to stay in that.
Yeah.
So he had the hardship of living in a wooden barracks for the first year he was there.
Yeah.
But there were 4 boys to a girl then, and that was fun.
Wow.
we had a lot of dates.
So what's been the favorite period of your life? Like, was it in your teenage years? Is it now? Was it in your 40s? What's been your favorite period?
I think a lot of people would look back to their teen years as being a lot of fun, and I think that's what I remember starting to really enjoy school. I didn't particularly enjoy sitting in the grammar school. It was very boring. You'd sit there and just got that desk, and you're supposed to just sit there for so long. I was glad when we got junior high school, 7th grade, we got to change classes. But that was fun, and I loved being a teenager, and I loved my school, Peabody, which was a small little school, and I got to do a lot of things. I got to be a cheerleader my senior year, and that was fun.
That's great.
And we played NBA. I think we won a basketball game from them. But every phase of life, I've found things that I really enjoyed, and enjoyed being a mother and a grandmother. I guess the most thing I've enjoyed was all these grandchildren.
And we were here all the time.
And, she has 4, and Charles has 2. So there were 6 right here. And then, of course, Marilyn would visit with her family now and then. But they would spend the night with me. And when Catherine was little, she and Barrett, who was her older brother, 2 or 3 years older, would spend the night with me, usually every Friday night, and every Sunday night, and every Tuesday night. Wow, because Ann had 4 children, and she would let me have the 2 oldest. And then she started letting me have Stephen and Elizabeth, the younger ones. So, and I just every Friday night I love the tradition of feeding them spaghetti usually. But
Now I'm feeding my grandchildren spaghetti.
and now Catherine's going to have some grandchildren one of these days.
It'll be a
Not
while.
But I just think that there are different phases of your life. I love going to conferences in Chapel Hill with Charles and I, and being with Christian friends up there. And he had this beautiful Christian conference center we had helped him to build, and that was fun. And now I'm in the stage of life so many of our good friends are no longer here, and so I guess now I can look forward to the golden streets.
Yeah.
But I feel like in heaven we're really going to see those loved ones we have cherished and missed, and that's going to be something to look forward to.
Absolutely.
And,
And what